welcome to another Talking Churchill. Joining me today is Professor Richard Toye from the University of Exeter, and you'll know me as Warren Dockter from the University of Cambridge. Today we're going to be talking about Winston Churchill's relationship with President Roosevelt during the Second World War. And Richard, I was hoping that you could sort of explain a little bit about this, about the two sort of historiographies, about how people engage with their relationship.
Well, I think that really there are two ways of looking at this relationship. Churchill, of course, in his own memoirs, portrayed it as a very close and intimate relationship, and there is a strand in the historiography which essentially follows that and says that here was history being made by two great men who were on kind of warm and very friendly terms. There's another strand in the literature which says, well, this is a sort of a myth, and that it's not so much that there were daggers drawn, but that the relationship was certainly far less warm and friendly than Churchill liked to portray it. And I suppose the sort of the symbol of that is taken as being that Churchill, in fact, when Roosevelt died in 1945, he didn't make the effort to go to the funeral. So I think that, from my point of view, the relationship is an ambiguous one, and it's difficult to tease out the truth of some of this. I mean, what's your view about how close this relationship really was?
I had, when I was younger, probably my undergraduate, read a book called Franklin and Winston, which is about it follows the sort of Churchill's own memoirs, and looks at their relationship in a very sort of warm way, and uses their sort of things, and includes a lot of the apocryphal stories about the relationship, things like Roosevelt seeing Winston Churchill naked in the White House, and then Churchill saying, "I have nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Of course, that's one of the famous ones. And then there are other apocryphal stories that were included that were very amusing. The one about Churchill believing that President Roosevelt drank too much because he always had martinis, very strong martinis, and of course Roosevelt thinking that Churchill drank too much because he always had a weak whiskey, not really realizing that it wasn't as strong on either case as they might have supposed. So I came from it understanding the relationship from that sort of position. But as you start engaging with the other historiography and you start reading the actual, what do I want to say, cables and sort of memos between them, you can tell that they're, despite, I mean, I do think there was probably some personal warmth.
Yeah.
But I think that it really emerges that, setting that aside, this is still sort of grand strategy happening, and people are still jockeying for position, which you would expect from a president and a prime minister.
Of course. I mean, it's worth saying, as is often noted, that Churchill's side of the correspondence, this is a fact correspondence that sort of runs to sort of 3 printed volumes. Churchill was sending far more cables to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was much more likely to get a quick reply from Churchill than Churchill was from Roosevelt. So it was one-sided to a degree. You've got to remember, of course, that during the period 1940 to 1941, Churchill was absolutely desperate for the Americans to get into the war, and was trying to sort of court Roosevelt, if you will. And indeed, he says at some point in his memoirs that he sort of studied President Roosevelt's cables as carefully as any man's ever studied the whims of his mistress. Right? So clearly there was a kind of a power imbalance in this relationship, and this becomes even more clear as we go towards the end of the war, and Britain's relative contribution it becomes less, in contrast to the military contribution of the United States and the USSR. We've got to remember there's a three-way relationship involving Stalin as well. Nevertheless, all those things said, I agree with you that you can't just portray Roosevelt as a completely sort of calculating machine who was always thinking about politics. He did have a human side, and I think there were in fact times when he went a little bit, at least, out of his way to do things for Churchill, perhaps not necessarily on the basis of friendship, but to some degree out of sympathy for Britain.
Yeah.
And
particularly early on, I would have thought.
Yes.
With Lend-Lease and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a part of the historiography which tries to say, well, the Americans were consistently working the British over, were being completely sort of hard-hearted and hard-headed, and never gave the British a break. And I don't really think that's fair. That actually the Americans did do more for the British than in some senses they strictly needed to. But of course, you've got to remember, they were looking at it from the point of view of their own fundamental national interest, rather than that of Britain, and that's actually perfectly natural.
Exactly, and that's my point. That's what certainly emerges, I think, in various bits of the correspondence between Churchill and Roosevelt, is the fact that both men are working for their national interest. And it's clear from very early on, in fact, because Churchill's courting Roosevelt, that the relationship becomes not one on parity, one of a junior partner and a senior partner. And Churchill sort of knows that very early on, and you can see that in the correspondence. And when one of the interesting ways the two come to loggerheads is particularly over India, because of course one of Roosevelt's demands is, well, the British Empire has to sort of slowly retract from India, and Churchill doesn't want to do this and uses all sorts of things, including Muslim civil rights, as a sort of means to try to keep British power in India. And this goes back and forth between the two of them. So you can see it's not just the national interest in that Churchill's also trying to safeguard, but it's also the imperial interest.
And also it's worth saying on that is one of the sort of few areas where Churchill was overtly critical of Roosevelt in his war memoirs over India. But I would also say that there was a lot. What we haven't talked about is Roosevelt's political position. You've got to remember he wasn't a free agent. He had to deal with Congress. He had to deal with public opinion. And so there is a certain amount of public posturing that goes on. Now, there are some efforts to from America and Roosevelt to get involved in the Indian situation. But fundamentally, although Roosevelt makes clear what his position is and that he thinks that the British ought to move more rapidly in the direction of self-government for India, he never really sort of presses the point to an extreme. He doesn't use the potential power or leverage that he had. And so I think there's an element of him saying stuff, including in the cables, and indeed the things that he says in public, in press conferences and so on, saying stuff because he needs to be seen to be saying it for political reasons.
Right. Not
that he's actually going to really prioritise this as a particular issue.
Yeah. I just want to unpack one bit you touched on there is the political environment in which in which President Roosevelt is working, and I wonder to what extent during the sort of courting phase, Churchill also recognized that he had to not only court President Roosevelt but also the American public, and at what point do you think he sort of accomplishes this?
Well, I mean, in a sense, fundamentally, the only thing that is going to bring America into the war is Pearl Harbor, right?
Right.
What if the Japanese had sort of held back, from their own self-interest point of view, would actually been a very wise thing to do in the longer run. Churchill, much as he tried to, sort of couldn't just persuade the Americans into the war. There had to be some radical development which was going to bring them in. Yeah. And so, nevertheless, what he could do, and really at the public level, he certainly couldn't say, I want America involved in the war. Actually, he's quite explicit. He's not really telling the truth. He explicitly says, well, we don't want you involved in the war. What we want is your economic help. Give us the tools and we will finish the job, right? You don't need to bother yourselves about military involvement. Just give us the economic assistance and the military supplies. Now, he doesn't really mean that, but certainly Churchill's speeches can be seen, and they succeed in their own, in a limited way, quite effectively, as being aimed at American public opinion, and indeed sort of, you might call this kind of a form of public diplomacy aimed at Roosevelt in some degrees as well. And so he certainly does a very good job of that, but as I say, that in itself is not going to bring the Americans into the war, however persuasive the speeches are.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for tuning in to Talking Churchill.